The first tear fell before the vicar had finished speaking. It caught the light from the chapel's narrow windows, winter morning, pale and bright through ancient glass, and traced a line down the Duke of Stanwic's jaw before anyone thought to look away. Miles Corvin did not lift his hand to clear it. He stood at the stone font with his son in his arms, the child wrapped in 3 generations of Corvin christening lace, and he wept, as though something inside him had come undone at the seams. The assembled guests did not know where to look. Lady Anstruther, seated in the second pew with her gloves folded precisely across her knee, exchanged a glance with the woman beside her, a glance that said everything her mouth would not, at least not here, not yet. She had spent the better part of a year saying it elsewhere. In drawing rooms across Mayfair, at card tables in Bath, over tea in houses where the Stanwick name still carried the particular weight of old money and older silence, Lady Anstruther had offered her assessment of the Duke's marriage with the confidence of a woman who believed herself generous for not saying worse. A quiet girl, she had called Dorothea Corvin, a country vicar's niece with no fortune, no connections, no particular beauty to speak of, though she allowed that the Duchess carried herself well enough, if one were inclined to notice such things. The match had puzzled society from the start. Miles Corvin was not a man who puzzled easily. He was deliberate in all things. In his dress, his speech, his politics, his long absences from town during the season when other men of his rank would have been seen at every ball and assembly. He had taken his seat in the House of Lords at 22, spoken once on a matter of enclosure, with such precision that 3 older peers had afterward asked his name, and then retreated to Stanwick Hall as though London were a room he had entered only to confirm he did not wish to stay. When the engagement was announced, Lady Anstruther had laughed, not cruelly, she would have said, but with the particular amusement of a woman who believed she understood the world and found it predictable. "He has chosen a girl who will not challenge him," she told Lord Pembury at the Harringtons' supper. "A girl who will manage his house and bear his children and never once ask him to explain himself. It is not a love match. It is an arrangement dressed in muslin." Lord Pembury had said nothing. He had known Miles Corvin since Eton, and he had learned that the things Miles did not explain were usually the things that mattered most. The marriage, from the outside, had confirmed every prediction Lady Anstruther had made. The Duke and Duchess were seen together rarely. When they appeared at the few events they attended, a dinner at Lord Ashwick's, a charity concert at the Assembly Rooms, they were polite, composed, and entirely unremarkable. Dorothea spoke when spoken to and did not seek attention. Miles stood beside her with the same careful stillness he brought to everything, and if his hand occasionally found the small of her back when they moved through a crowded room, no one thought to read anything into it. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was the letter. Miles had written it the night before their wedding. He had sat in his study at Stanwick Hall, with the fire burned to embers and the candles guttering in their holders, and he had written to the woman who was, in 12 hours, to become his wife. He had not planned to write it. He had planned to retire early, to sleep, to stand before the vicar in the morning with the composure his rank demanded. But the composure would not hold. It kept splitting open at the edges, letting through something he had carried for months and never spoken aloud, and by midnight he had covered 4 pages in a hand that grew less steady as the words accumulated. He had told her everything. He told her that he had noticed her first at her uncle's rectory, where he had gone to discuss a matter of parish tithes, and found her reading in the garden with her shoes beside her on the bench. The book was Virgil, not a translation, the Latin, and when she looked up at his approach her expression had not changed. She had not startled or smoothed her dress or reached for her shoes. She had simply looked at him with the calm directness of a woman who did not consider herself someone to be caught at anything. And he had thought, "There, that is the thing I have been looking for without knowing I was looking." He told her that he had returned 3 times on invented business before he admitted to himself why. Once about the church roof, which did not need discussing. Once about the arrangement of flowers for the harvest festival, which was so transparently beneath the Duke's notice that Reverend Parrish had looked at him with gentle bewilderment and offered him tea. The 3rd time he had come with no excuse at all and found her at the gate, as though she had been waiting, and she had said with that devastating composure, "Your Grace, if there is a matter requiring attention, I am certain my uncle will be available shortly. If there is not, I have just made lemon cakes, and they are better warm." He had stayed for 2 hours. They had talked about land management, about Cowper's poetry, about the particular light that fell across the Stanwyck Valley in autumn. She had opinions, sharp, considered, delivered without apology, and she offered them as though she expected him to engage with them as equals. No one had spoken to him that way since Pembury, and Pembury had the advantage of having known him before the title. He told her that her composure, which others mistook for dullness, for lack of spirit, struck him as the most extraordinary act of will he had ever witnessed, because he recognized it. He knew what it cost to hold oneself still when everything inside was moving. He told her he was afraid, that he did not know how to be a husband who was also a companion, that his own parents' marriage had been a masterwork of formality and distance, and he feared he had inherited their talent for silence without inheriting whatever it was that made silence bearable. He told her he suspected she was marrying him out of obligation. Her uncle's living depended on the Stanwyck estate, her family's comfort rested on his goodwill, and he could not be certain she had ever had a genuine choice. He told her that if she read this letter and wished to withdraw, he would ensure her uncle's position remained secure and her family would want for nothing. He told her he would rather lose her honestly than keep her through obligation. And then, at the bottom of the 4th page, in handwriting that had abandoned all pretense of steadiness, he told her he loved her. Not the way the poets meant it, not as performance or declaration, but as a fact he had discovered about himself, the way one discovers a room in a house one has lived in for years. It had always been there. He had simply not known to open the door. He had folded the letter, sealed it with plain wax, not the Stanwyck crest because this was not the Duke writing, and slipped it beneath her door in the east corridor at 1:30 in the morning. Then he had gone to bed and not slept at all. She had never mentioned it. She married him the following morning with steady hands and clear eyes. She spoke her vows without hesitation. She moved into Stanwyck Hall and took up the duties of a duchess with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been observing the world carefully for a very long time and knew exactly how it worked. She consulted Mrs. Selby on the household accounts. She met with Graves about the tenant cottages. She sat across from Miles at breakfast and dinner with a composure that might have been mistaken for indifference by anyone who was not paying very close attention. Miles paid very close attention. He watched for any sign, a glance, a shift in her voice, a moment of hesitation that would tell him she had read the letter, that she knew. He could not bring himself to ask. The asking would have required him to stand in the same vulnerability the letter had put him in, and he had used all his courage on the writing. So he watched, and he waited, and he said nothing, and the distance between them, which was not coldness but caution, not indifference but a kind of terrified care, grew into something that looked from the outside exactly like the arrangement Lady Anstruther had described. The months passed. Dorothea oversaw the redecoration of the East Wing drawing room, replacing the heavy Jacobean curtains with lighter fabric that let the morning sun reach the far wall. She walked the grounds with Mrs. Selby every Tuesday, reviewing the week's provisions. She read in the library after dinner while Miles worked at his desk, and sometimes he would look up and find her watching him with an expression he could not quite decipher, not warm, not cold, but searching, as though she were reading a document written in a language she had not yet decided whether to trust. He began to leave small things for her. A volume of Cowper's poetry left on her chair with no note. A cutting from the glass house, the first forced hyacinth of the season, placed in a small vase on her writing desk. An instruction to Graves that the south-facing sitting room she preferred should have its fire lit an hour before she typically retired there. He never mentioned these things. She never acknowledged them. But the hyacinth appeared in her hair at dinner that evening, and the Cowper was open on her lap the following morning, and the fire was always burning when she arrived. Lord Pembury visited in November and found them at dinner. He sat between them and watched the way Miles passed Dorothea the salt cellar before she reached for it, the way her fingers brushed his wrist as she took it, the way neither of them looked at the other, and both of them paused for exactly the same half-second before continuing to eat. When Miles excused himself after the meal to attend to correspondence, Pembury remained with the Duchess and said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided it was not his place to interfere, but found himself unable to stay entirely silent, "You know, he is not as difficult to read as he believes himself to be." Dorothea had looked at him with those steady gray eyes and replied, "I am aware." Pembury had left the following morning with the distinct impression that he understood even less about this marriage than he had thought, and that this was probably a good sign. By winter, Dorothea was with child. The news altered nothing visible. Miles received it from the physician with a nod, asked after her health, and instructed Mrs. Selby to ensure the Duchess had whatever she required. He did not embrace her. He did not weep. He went to his study and sat for a very long time with his hands flat on the desk. And when he emerged for dinner, his eyes were red, and his voice was perfectly steady, and he asked Dorothea whether she preferred the roast or the game pie with such careful normality that she set down her fork and looked at him for a long moment and said, "Miles, you do not have to hold everything so tightly." It was the first time she had used his Christian name outside of the required forms of their wedding. He had looked at her across the length of the dining table, the candles between them, the silence of the room, the portrait of his father watching from the wall with the same careful blankness Miles had spent his life perfecting. And he had said, "I do not know how to do otherwise." And she had said, "I know. I read your letter." The world did not end. The dining room did not collapse. The candles continued to burn, and the fire continued to crackle, and somewhere in the kitchen, Mrs. Selby was discussing the morning's bread order with the cook. But something shifted between them, not dramatically, not with the force of revelation, but with the quiet precision of a key turning in a lock that had been waiting. She told him she had read it the morning of their wedding. She had found it when she woke, before dawn, slipped beneath her door on plain paper with plain wax. She had read it twice, sitting on the edge of her bed with her feet bare on the cold floor. She had folded it and placed it in the bottom of her traveling case, beneath her stockings where no maid would find it. And she had married him 3 hours later with steady hands, because the letter had told her the one thing she needed to know, that his silence was not indifference, that his composure was not absence, that beneath the formality and the distance and the carefully maintained blankness was a man who had written 4 pages in a shaking hand because he could not bear the thought of keeping her through anything less than honesty. She had not mentioned it because she wanted to see if the man who wrote the letter would eventually become the man who sat across from her at breakfast. She was patient. She had always been patient. It was, she told him, the one advantage of being underestimated. No one expected you to be in a hurry. The months that followed were not a transformation. Miles did not suddenly become demonstrative or voluble. He did not make public declarations or sweep her into his arms in front of guests. But the distance closed, slowly, by degrees so small they were visible only to the 2 people who occupied them. He began to sit beside her in the library instead of across the room. He asked her opinion on the estate's drainage works and listened to her answer with the seriousness he would have given a fellow peer. He took her hand during their evening walk and did not let go when they passed a gardener on the path. Mrs. Selby, who had served 3 generations of Corvins and understood the family the way a cartographer understands coastline, by its visible edges, not its depths, noticed the change before anyone else. She said nothing to the staff, because Mrs. Selby believed that the private lives of one's employers were sacred territory. But she began setting 2 chairs beside the library fire instead of 1, and she instructed the kitchen to send up a single tray of chocolate in the evening, rather than 2 separate services to 2 separate rooms. Graves noticed too. The steward had managed Stanwix's tenants and accounts for 9 years, and he had grown accustomed to receiving his instructions from the Duke alone, brief, precise, delivered without pleasantries. Now the Duchess appeared at estate meetings, sitting beside Miles with a leather-bound notebook she had begun keeping, filled with observations about the tenant cottages, the drainage, the condition of the roads after the autumn rains. She did not overrule or redirect. She asked questions, careful, specific, informed questions that made Graves revise his initial assessment of her as a woman who would confine herself to the house and leave the land to men who understood it. She understood it. She had grown up in a rectory where her uncle tended both souls and soil, and she knew the difference between a drainage ditch that was adequate and one that would hold. And once, on a morning in February when the frost had silvered every window and the baby had moved for the first time, she had placed his hand against her belly without speaking, and he had stood there in the cold light of the breakfast room with his palm pressed to the place where his child was making itself known, and his face had done something she had never seen it do before. He had let it show. Not much, not for long, but enough. The spring came slowly that year, as though the season itself were uncertain whether to commit. Crocuses appeared in the south garden in March and were buried again by a late frost. The lambing was difficult. 3 ewes lost in 1 week, and Miles spent long hours with the shepherds in the fields, while Dorothea managed the house with the same quiet authority she brought to everything. She grew larger. She moved more slowly. She sat in her chair by the window in the sitting room, with one hand resting on the swell of her belly and the other turning the pages of whatever she was reading. And sometimes she would pause and look out at the grounds, the avenue of limes, the distant hills, the church tower just visible above the tree line, with an expression that was not quite contentment, but something adjacent to it, something that had earned the right to be called peace. And now the child was here. Edmund Miles Corvin, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, born on a Tuesday in September with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and a voice that filled Stanwick Hall with a sound it had not heard in a generation. Mrs. Selby had wept in the kitchen when the physician announced the birth was safely done, and then composed herself and sent up fresh linens and a pot of broth and a small arrangement of late roses from the garden, because she believed that a house marked its important moments with flowers, whether anyone asked for them or not. Miles had held his son for the first time in the amber light of the bedchamber, with Dorothea propped against pillows and the physician packing his bag, and the afternoon sun falling in a long rectangle across the counterpane. The child was impossibly small. Miles held him with the exaggerated care of a man who had managed a 12,000-acre estate without anxiety, but found himself terrified by 7 pounds of sleeping infant, and Dorothea had watched him and said nothing, and her silence was the kindest thing she had ever given him. The christening had been arranged for a bright morning in late October in the private chapel where every Corvin for 200 years had been baptized. The chapel was old, older than the hall itself, built of pale gray stone that held the cold in summer and the damp in winter, and the light, always the light, which fell through the narrow lancet windows in columns so defined they looked almost solid, as though one might reach out and rest a hand upon them. The pews were oak, dark with age, smelling faintly of beeswax and centuries. The font was Norman, a great carved bowl on a pedestal of worn limestone, the same font that had held the water for Miles's christening and his father's and his grandfather's before that. The guests were few, family, close acquaintance, Lord Pembury standing at the back with his arms folded and his face carefully neutral, Lady Anstruther in the second pew, because she had married well enough to be invited and spoke loudly enough to be feared. The vicar was Reverend Parrish, Dorothea's uncle, a quiet man with careful hands who held the child as though he were made of something that might dissolve. The ceremony was brief. The words were ancient. The water was cold, and Edmund wailed at the shock of it, and then settled against his father's chest with the boneless surrender of a creature who had decided that this particular human was acceptable. And Miles had wept, not during the vows, not at the water, but in the silence afterward, the moment when the vicar stepped back and the chapel held its breath, and the morning light fell through the narrow windows in pale columns that turned the dust to gold. In that silence, with his son's weight against his ribs and his wife standing beside him with her hands folded and her expression perfectly composed, something in Miles Corvin's chest had opened like a door he had forgotten existed, and what came through it was too large and too old and too honest to be contained by the architecture of his face. Lady Anstruther stared. She did not mean to stare. It was vulgar, and she prided herself on never being vulgar, but she could not look away. She had never seen the Duke of Stanwick display any emotion stronger than mild approval, and here he was weeping openly in a chapel full of people who would remember this for years. She felt a flicker of something she might, in a more generous moment, have identified as shame, because the tears made nonsense of everything she had said about this marriage, and she could feel the ground beneath her year of commentary beginning to shift. Lord Pembury, at the back, watched his oldest friend weep and felt something tighten in his own throat. He said nothing. He had learned, over 30 years of friendship, that the most important things he could do for Miles Corvin were the things he did not say. Dorothea stood very still. She looked at her husband, and she looked at her son, and she looked at the assembled guests, family and society, and the vicar who had raised her after her parents' death, and the woman in the second pew who had spent a year telling anyone who would listen that this marriage was a transaction dressed in silk. And then she did something no one expected. She stepped forward. She did not announce what she was about to do. She did not ask permission. She reached into the small silk reticule she carried, dove gray, matching her dress, the kind of practical accessory Lady Anstruther would have called unfashionable, and she drew out a letter. 4 pages, folded twice, the wax seal long since broken. The paper had softened at the creases from handling, though she had been careful with it. She had always been careful with it. The chapel was absolutely silent. She unfolded the letter and she read. Her voice was steady, not loud, not performative, but clear in the way that a bell is clear, carrying to every corner of the stone chapel without effort. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, not from nerves, but from the softness of it, the way 4 pages that have been folded and unfolded and held and refolded will eventually develop a life of their own, a tendency to move with any current of air. She held it carefully, the way one holds something that is both fragile and indestructible. She read his words back to him. She read about the rectory garden and the shoes on the bench and the Virgil she had been reading when he first saw her. She read about the 3 visits on invented business, the church roof, the harvest flowers, the visit with no excuse at all, and in the 3rd pew, a woman who had known Reverend Parrish for 20 years pressed her hand to her chest and thought of the baffled old vicar offering tea to a duke who had come to discuss chrysanthemums. She read about his fear that he had inherited his parents' talent for silence. She read about the lemon cakes. She read the passage about obligation, the offer to release her, to protect her family regardless, to lose her honestly rather than keep her through debt. And in the 2nd pew, Lady Anstruther's gloved hand rose to her mouth and stayed there. The chapel was very quiet. The only sounds were Dorothea's voice, the occasional shift of a guest on the oak pews, and the soft, formless sounds Edmund made against his father's chest, the sounds of a child who did not yet know that something extraordinary was happening around him and would not have cared if he did. She read about the room in the house, the door he had not known to open. She read the last line, the one he had written in handwriting that had given up all pretense of steadiness, and when she finished, the silence in the chapel was not the silence of embarrassment or discomfort. It was the silence of recognition. Every person in that room understood, in the space of 4 pages, exactly what kind of man the Duke of Stanwick was, and exactly what kind of marriage this had always been. Miles stood with his son in his arms and his wife's voice still hanging in the air, and he did not look at the guests. He looked at Dorothea. She folded the letter, carefully along the same creases, and placed it back in her reticule. Then she looked up at him, and the expression on her face was not triumph and not defiance and not even love exactly, but something closer to certainty. The certainty of a woman who had kept a letter for over a year, who had waited and watched and chosen her moment with the same deliberate patience she brought to everything, and who understood that the most powerful thing she could do with his vulnerability was not to protect it, but to honor it. Edmund made a small sound against his father's chest. The morning light shifted. Somewhere in the chapel someone exhaled. Lord Pembury unfolded his arms and looked at the floor and pressed his lips together very tightly and thought, "Yes, that is exactly right." Lady Anstruther sat in the 2nd pew with her hand still at her mouth in her commentary, a year of it, confident and clever and entirely wrong, dissolving around her like sugar in rain. She would not speak of the Stanwick marriage again, not because she had been silenced, but because she had nothing left to say. The letter had answered every question she had ever asked about this match, and the answers had made her look very small. The guests filed out into the October morning, bright, cold, the kind of light that makes everything look scrubbed and new. Dorothea walked beside Miles with her hand on his arm and Edmund between them, and she did not look back at the chapel. She did not need to. The moment was complete. That evening, after the guests had departed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Miles found Dorothea in her sitting room. The fire was lit. Graves had seen to it, as he always did, and she was sitting in the chair by the window with the letter open on her lap, not reading it, just holding it. The candles on the mantelpiece cast a warm, uneven light across her face, and through the window, the last of the October twilight was fading over the park, the avenue of limes reduced to dark shapes against a sky the color of bruised plums. Edmund was asleep in the nursery. Mrs. Selby had taken him up an hour ago, wrapped in the christening shawl, and the house was quieter than it had been all day, quieter perhaps than it had been in months, the kind of quiet that comes after something important has happened and the world has not yet decided what to do with it. Miles sat down across from her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire shifted. A log settled. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the park, and another answered from the direction of the church. Then he said, "I did not know you were going to do that." She looked at him. "No," she said, "you did not." He was quiet for another moment. Then, "Why today?" "Because today you let them see you," she said, "and I wanted them to understand what they were seeing." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. She let him. They sat like that while the fire burned down and the candles guttered and the house settled around them like a held breath finally released. Years later, when Edmund was old enough to read and his sister Constance was old enough to ask questions about everything, the letter hung in a simple frame in Dorothea's sitting room. Not hidden, not displayed, simply present, the way the best truths are. Visitors to Stanwyck Hall occasionally noticed it and asked what it was, and Dorothea would say, with the composure that had become her particular signature, "A letter my husband wrote me before we were married." She never said more than that. She did not need to. The people who mattered already knew the story, and the people who did not know the story could see, in the way Miles looked at his wife across every room they shared, that the letter had only been the beginning of something that words, even 4 pages of them, written in a shaking hand by a man who had run out of ways to be silent, could never quite contain. Lord Pembury, who outlived most of his generation and was known in his later years for saying less and less about things that mattered more and more, was once asked at a dinner party whether the Duke of Stanwyck's marriage was truly as remarkable as people said. He considered the question for a moment. Then he said, "I have known Miles Corvin for 40 years. I've seen him stand before the House of Lords and argue a position until grown men changed their votes. I've seen him manage an estate that would break lesser men without raising his voice. But the bravest thing I ever saw him do was write a letter he believed no one would answer and marry the woman who answered it by saying nothing at all." It was the most Lord Pembury had said about the subject in 3 decades. The dinner guests waited for him to continue. He did not. Miles never asked Dorothea why she had chosen the christening. He already knew. She had waited until there was something to show, not the letter itself, but what the letter had built. A child. A marriage. A man standing in a chapel letting the world see him as he was. She had read his confession aloud not to expose him, but to complete him, to say, in front of every person who had doubted and dismissed and predicted, that she had seen him from the beginning and chosen him anyway, that she had always chosen him, that the door he had not known to open had been unlocked from her side all along. On a shelf in the nursery at Stanwyck Hall, beside the christening lace and the silver cup engraved with Edmund's initials, there was a small watercolor Dorothea had painted in the weeks after the ceremony. It showed the chapel in morning light, the narrow windows, the stone font, the pale columns of dust turned to gold. No figures, just the room, just the light, just the silence after the words had been spoken and before the world resumed. It was, she thought, the truest portrait of her marriage she could paint. Not the people in it, but the quality of the light they made between them. And if you have found yourself here, in this chapel, in this silence, in the space between a letter written and a letter read, then perhaps you understand what Dorothea understood on the morning she married a man who had given her every reason to leave, and none of the words to make her stay, and stayed anyway. Perhaps you understand that the bravest things are not the loudest, and that the truest words are sometimes the ones that wait the longest to be spoken. They arrive here, like a letter kept for the right moment, whenever they are ready.